If you look at the Christian church types that dot the American landscape today, perhaps the most dominant building type is the neoclassical adaptation of the Roman Hellenistic pagan temple applied to variants of the 1, 3, and 5-aisle versions of the Constantine Basilica. In this presentation, we'll examine two very important buildings that today still affect the design of many public buildings and churches. One of these buildings began construction prior to the French Revolution, the Paris Pantheon, with its often copied triple dome on a colonnaded drum. The Paris Pantheon underwent many reconstructions as the leanings of the government went from Christian to secular and back and forth several times during its history. We'll also look at the Petite Jewel Box Roman Temple in Nîmes, France. Constructed in 4 AD, this temple is something that Jefferson freely copied in his designs for the Virginia State House, the University of Virginia, and other buildings. These two buildings became the ubiquitous prototype for many American universities, public buildings, state capitol buildings, including both countless Catholic and Protestant churches. For better and sometimes worse, neoclassical buildings are still used today to indicate learning, wisdom, and wealth. Let's take a look at their importance in the American church architecture.
I'm going to go to the next period. This is in the Cluny Museum of Paris, and you can see all these saints and prophets that have been decapitated. I was going to say decaffeinated, but that's not what I meant. They've been decapitated during the French Revolution. And I wanted to quote in some red graphics, Après moi le déluge, which is, I believe, Louis XV, is meaning pretty much after me, the flood, and the flood of blood is what he's talking about. The next presentation is neoclassical, and this is where the ancient Greeks come to the New World via France and Thomas Jefferson. And I'm jumping ahead to right around our Civil War, and this happens to be the dome of the US Capitol. And how I got to the US Capitol is through neoclassical architecture, and I'll explain that in a little bit, but I thought I'd bring this to your attention because I find it very interesting. You can see that this is, of course, a trompe-l'oeil, and what it is George Washington, and then there's 13 figures, each one that has a star over their head for the colonies, and then these are various aspects of our culture roundabout. And this over 4,000 square foot fresco is called the Apotheosis of Washington. And the apotheosis is elevating or ascending to heaven, becoming godlike. That is in the main dome of our US Capitol. And this is a close-up of George Washington, and he's cloaked in royal purple, and he's ascending to heaven on a rainbow. He's flanked by liberty and victory/fame, and the symbolism of what they are holding is included. And there's the rainbow supporting Washington's ascent, his godlike ascent. And this is something I found very interesting and a bit provocative. Liberty is wearing a red worker's cap of the Paris Commune. I had no idea that a communard would be ascending to heaven with George Washington in our US Capitol, but there she is. So this takes us back to France. So how did all this happen? Back in the 5th century, Paris had a nun called Saint Genevieve. She was very astute, very kind person, very smart, evidently a very good politician. She is the patron saint of Paris. She kept the German tribes and the Huns from sacking Paris. And she was buried in the abbey built in 1502 by King Clovis and Queen Clotilde on the high ground on the left bank, what is now the Latin Quarter of Paris. It's the highest spot on the left bank of Paris. The abbey's right here, what it looked like at one time. And the abbey was renamed for her and became the center of medieval learning. Well, let's jump forward a bit to the neoclassical period. Louis XV reigned for the second longest period in French history after, I think it was his grandfather was Louis XIV. The 14th reigned for like 79 years or something. Louis was 50 some, Louis XV was 50 some years. He became very ill during his tenure as king, and he prayed and prayed and prayed to his son Genevieve, and he recovered. So he said he wanted to finance to replace the old worn out, broken down abbey with a new church. And so he started to build and design and build the Pantheon, it's called, in Paris. It wasn't originally called the Pantheon, it was called the Church of Saint Genevieve, but it has an interesting history. It started out as, we were talking earlier about the Sagrada Familia as a Gothic church, but a lot of things happened between the beginning and its final configuration. So what happened to the Pantheon, and this is important to our culture, is a new church in 1715 was dedicated to Saint Genevieve by Louis XV. In 1789 was the French Revolution, which you'll see here is liberty and priest separating. It's called La Séparation. So that's what happened in the French Revolution. But it wasn't a straight line of now we're separate from the church, we're separate, now we're back together, we're separate, now we're back together, and I'll just run through this real quickly. It became a temple devoted to liberty, and it was renamed the Pantheon as a mausoleum for distinguished French citizens. The Pantheon in Rome, I think back in the 15th century or 16th century, was used as a mausoleum, and that's where the idea came from. It was a temple for the nation. The lower windows were filled with bricks with frosted glass, and the upper windows to darken the interior. Religious friezes and statues were destroyed. Kind of a typical action for that period. And then in 1816, this is after Napoleon, the Bourbon Restoration by Louis XVIII, it became a church once again, and Louis XVIII was the last Bourbon or the monarch to occupy, being the leader of France. In 1830, Louis Philippe restores the Pantheon as a mausoleum. So we go from church to a mausoleum to a church, back to a mausoleum. Louis Napoleon declares the Pantheon as a temple of humanity, and then Napoleon III coup, it becomes a church once again. So it's going back and forth, back and forth. And if Daniel Buettner, if you're out there, you ask the question about who owns these or who takes care of these churches, and I was partially correct, but it wasn't a direct line of after the revolution, the state took over the churches, went back and forth several times, and I believe the state does own and maintains the Gothic cathedrals in France, but the Catholic Church operates them. And then the Third Republic restored the Pantheon to its present use as a mausoleum. There are 73 men and 5 women buried in the Pantheon. The first woman, Madame Curie, was interred there in 1995. So the French drug their feet before they recognized the significance of women's contributions to their society. Other people like writer Victor Hugo is there, and I'll show you a little bit more of some of the other people. And notice that Liberty has a red workers cap of the Paris Commune. That's the same as Liberty sitting next to George Washington. I'm just fascinated by this transference of the French Communist Workers' Party to a seat on the right hand of George. This is what the crypt of the Pantheon looks like. And I thought I'd present these first because it is a mausoleum. And up here is a typical tomb room where you can see a tomb back here. There's some tombs on the side. It's vaulted, it's stone, and there's a slight opening to let in some natural light. The main crypt is a series of beautifully carved groin vaults and side aisle, beautifully carved groin vaults. And I believe these vaults come off of the part of the groin vault that goes in this direction. And one of the famous people buried there is Voltaire. And the reason I bring him up is because he was a writer during the Enlightenment period. He criticized Christianity and particularly the Roman Catholic Church. He was an advocate of free speech, freedom of religion, and the separation of church and state. But I think his writings influence a great deal of the way people view the church today. But that's the way it was, and that's where he came from, this whole very, very important period of French Enlightenment. And here's an aerial of the Pantheon. Here's the west front. The apse is back here, and it faces Jerusalem. Probably not an accident, but there's something very important that I wanted to bring to your attention, particularly if you're a movie fan. Right there is where Owen Wilson was sitting on those stairs waiting for F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda to come up in that really cool open chauffeur car and take him off all sorts of neat things to do in midnight in Paris. That's where it is. So you can sit on those stairs. And when I was there, it was actually the laundromat across the street, not as romantic as the movie. Anyway, back to the parts of the Pantheon that are important. It has an apse. It has what I call an altar. It's not an altar in our sense. It has a narthex and a porch. That porch has 6 columns across the front. It's called the hexastyle porch. It has 6 columns. This is the west facade facing towards Paris. There is a dome and a lantern. The lantern's up here, the dome, colonnaded drum, the drum here, so it's a double drum, one on top of the other, just like our nation's capital. Pediment. That pediment has been torn apart many times, depending on who was in charge, whether it became something to express liberty and rationalism or versus Christianity. The capitals are composite, columns are fluted, and there's a stylobate base to the front of this. So it has all the elements of Roman classical architecture, with the addition, of course, of the drum. And here inside, it's a cruciform plan, the main dome, and there's 4 saucer domes. These saucer domes can also be called blind domes. In this case, they do not have an oculus or some sort of natural lighting, so they're called blind domes as well. And these 3 drawings I put together, they're a little bit cramped for space, so bear with me. I hope it comes across legible. But here is an elevation of the front. Here is a section. So if you cut through here and look towards the rear, this is what you see. You can see there's a triple dome here, 1, 2, and 3, and the lantern above, and the bottom of the dome. Here's the colonnaded, the other side of the colonnade dome here, and then the nave. These are the saucer domes right here. I'll show you those a little bit. This is a blow up of this part right here. And I want to talk about how this works in terms of lighting, because why would you build 3 domes? There's the drum. There are the colonnaded drums, and the colonnaded drum in this detail is way down here. Oculus 1 on the outer dome, which is right here and right here. Oculus 2 on the middle dome, right here and right here. They don't show a hole here, but it's there. And Oculus 3 on the inner dome, which is the big one, biggest opening right here and right here. So these are all nested one inside the other. And then these are the saucer domes, also known as blind domes. You can see they don't penetrate the roof. You can see the roof framing above the saucer domes. They're very shallow. I want to show how lighting works in a triple dome or even a double dome, because this comes across the ocean, building I'm choosing to explain neoclassical architecture. So we have these, the lantern, the drum, and the colonnaded drum as sources of interior light. The windows are filled in with masonry, as I said before, and this is the section through the triple dome. And those blue arrows show sources of where light can come into the building Of course, it comes in 360 degrees. Try to keep it as simple as possible. So we have lighting coming in through as graphically simple as possible. So we have light coming in through the lantern, we have it coming in through the drum, and we have it coming in through the colonnaded drum. So lighting comes in through the drum and can get up through here. Lighting comes in through the lantern and comes down through the first oculus. You can go through the second oculus, a much more smaller opening. And then on the middle dome is the frescoes painted on this surface right here. You can see up through there and see this surface. And you'll see it's surrounded by light. So the middle dome has these arches, which lets the light in. There's one of them. It's cut through an arch. It's cut through an arch. And this is the arch that's beyond the oculus on the other side of this cut. And so light comes in through the first oculus and can enter these arches. This is supposed to be light coming in through this arch coming towards us and from the other side as well. So this middle dome is surrounded by light, and it controlled where it enters this space by the size and location of the arches. Frescoes painted on it. And then Oculus 3 on the inner dome allows light to spill onto the inside as well, but it's not direct light. And how these domes are compressed and extended and oculi are shaped in terms of their size and location from one another really starts to dictate the lighting that the frescoes and these domes are presented. Unfortunately, whenever you go to see some of these dome buildings, they're overlit. And so you really don't get the sense of what it was like to look up into this dome during its day. It would have been lit with candles and or torches or some sort of oil lamps. And so that light ends up spilling through the third oculus onto the coffered dome, inner dome, and then on down into the nave. So this is what it looks like from the inside. There's that main dome, 4 pendentives and 4 saucer domes around it. And let's take a look at it. And here's the altar. And I put the altar in quotes because it's not Christ. It's one of the periods when it became something other than a church, but it occupies the position of an altar. There's an apse and there's an etc., which does have religious iconography up in it. And then taking a look at this center dome here, that part in the middle is right here. You're looking at Oculus 3, which is the larger circle, and that little tiny circle right there is Oculus 2. And then you take that piece of the dome is blown up right here, and you can see Oculus 1 right here, Oculus 2, and Oculus 3. So the combination of all 3 of those presents the light that you see up there on this fresco. The architect of this building that I'm going to show you in the United States calls it Lumiere Mysterieuse. He used a double dome and control that, what he calls mysterious light in the dome of this church we're going to look at in a few minutes. So those are the 4 saucer domes. They're blind domes. Take a look at one of them in more detail. Round arches, of course, for a Roman church. And of course, frescoes at trompe-l'oeil. Oculus 1, 2, and 3. What's interesting is because it's not always a church, Leon Foucault made his famous pendulum proving the Earth's rotation when he suspended a 62-pound brass-coated lead bob with a 220-foot long wire from the dome of the Pantheon in 1851. They have a replica of that constantly on display. And I remember when I walked in, pendulum was going in like this direction, I think over one of these numbers. And I went around through the building for a couple hours and I came back and the pendulum moved about, I think each one of these is 15 degrees, if memory serves me correctly. But that wasn't the place where he first proved the Earth's rotation, but it was the most famous place where he proved the Earth's rotation. And then back to our old friend, Notre Dame in Paris, because the revolution was known as the Temple of Reason. And what they did was they wanted to enthrone atheism. This happened in 1793. And they built a temple inside the nave to reason, Temple of Philosophy at the Feast of Reason at Notre Dame de Paris, organized as part of the policy of de-Christianization of the Paris Commune in 1793. And this is what they did. They had a series of actors on this stage in the nave, and they built the Temple of Philosophy. They had an actress dressed up as a goddess of liberty, dressed in blue, white, and red, the French national colors. They made an altar of reason with busts of the great philosophers. They had a torch of truth. And guess what she's wearing? The red workers' cap of the Paris Commune. Okay, so let's leave that unhappy occurrence and go to something that Napoleon I built. He had returned the Pantheon back to a church, and he built this church called La Madeleine. It's not a place where you can go for lunch in Paris, but it was dedicated to Mary Magdalene by Napoleon I. And it's basically, it's a replica, not a replica, but it's based on the Parthenon in Athens. And you can see it's just a single bay. It has an apse, a narthex, a porch, and a nave. There's a perimeter colonnade around it. It has all the classical elements, and it has 3 saucer domes. But these domes are lighted, I believe, by skylights. And there's the pediment, and this is Christ in Judgment. And that's what it looks like on the inside. It's quite beautiful. I had the good fortune of attending a beautiful concert performance here one evening. Beautiful place, interior. And if you're Napoleon, you can put all kinds of money in it if you want. So this is dedicated to Mary Magdalene. Has an altar, an apse, an etc. And there's a saucer dome. And I believe it's naturally lit from above. Round arches, typical classical architecture. Here is a view of La Madeleine here, Place de la Concorde. The Louvre is here, and the Arc de Triomphe is here. This is the Champs-Élysées. And I want to digress a little bit to urban design and urban planning, because the French do it as well as anyone has done it. We used to do it pretty well in this country. The city of Charleston, South Carolina has done it extremely well. And then they've fallen off the bandwagon, and no one does city planning in this country very well anymore, unfortunately. But this is how it happens, and this is how it's done well. Here's Place de la Concorde, constructed in 1772, just in time for the revolution in '89. And here is an axis that ties together the Champs-Élysées to the L'Arc de Triomphe, and then the Tuileries Garden. The pyramid is here, and the Louvre opens up its arms in this area back here. So we have this very important axis going through Paris, and one of its most important open public spaces. And then there's another axis that crosses it, and they place 2 important buildings. This is Palais Bourbon, and this is La Madeleine, to terminate the axis of the crossing axis of where they constructed a bridge, put Palais Bourbon and La Madeleine to terminate those axes. In other words, architecture and city planning now engage each other. And this is a perfect use of a church. It's an important building in a city. You'll notice these other buildings, what they do is they form spaces called streets. And these buildings know their place in the urban milieu. They are subordinate to the space of the street, but where you have a special building, you place that at the end of an axis or to change directions. That's, I believe, one of the elements of the beauty of Paris is their understanding of urban design and urban planning and architecture, and how it all fits together to create a beautiful environment. Washington, D.C. has a lot of that. It was designed by Pierre L'Enfant, who was a Frenchman who knew of Paris, not at this level. He was before this time, but he understood it, and Washington, D.C. is blessed by that plan, unless you drive automobiles around it, which can be confusing, but nevertheless, I'll be glad to talk to you at any time about L'Enfant's plan, because I think it's the best urban plan in North America. Again, that's my opinion. And then terminating crossing axis is La Madeleine and the Palais Bourbon, which is also the French National Assembly. So these significant public buildings, one is a government building, the other one is a church. They terminate those axes. The Louvre and the Pyramid terminate this axis, and the Arc de Triomphe forms that axis, and the Arch de Défense, which is a couple of miles further, is still on this axis, and it goes on way on out. There's a connection to various parts of Paris that extend for quite a ways. And then the crossing of the axis is celebrated with the obelisk. The Luxor obelisk is placed there in 1836. And of course, this is the plaza, Place de la Concorde, where the guillotine was placed during the revolution, and many, many people lost their heads there as a result of that. The French, if you ask them about who designed pyramid, they'll tell you that I.M.Pei did. He's a Chinese architect. Well, if you talk to anybody else but the French, they'll say he's a Chinese-American architect. I never met Pei. He recently died, I'm saying within the past 10 years. But I know what he was thinking when he decided to do a pyramid of all things in front of the Louvre. Was he was playing a visual pun with the Egyptian obelisk. So he has the Egyptian pyramid on axis with the Luxor obelisk, which goes on down to the Arc de Triomphe. I think this is kind of an in-house joke with I.M.Pei. And of course, like any good Parisian, you hate the Eiffel Tower and you hate the pyramid because they're gauche, I guess. I thought it was pretty cool. But I did want to show the importance of good architecture in urban design. You can see these buildings form the street. They open up and give space to the church. The church terminates this. Place de la Concorde's down at the bottom. And here's this building up here, and it might be one of the department stores. And a good architect knows his place in the city. And if you'll notice that there's access coming off the back of this, and there is a turn and a round corner. And you'll see this happen in Washington, D.C. Next time you go around Washington, D.C., you'll see some of these turrets and corners turning the corner in L'Enfant's plan, where you get these irregular intersecting roadways. Anyway, so that's what you do with the church. And you can see the three skylights lighting the three saucer domes here. And I want to now start to turn to the United States. Before I leave Paris, there's schools still there. It started in 1648. It's called the École des Beaux-Arts. They dealt with the fine arts, including architecture. Much like medicine, many sculptors, painters, and architects started coming to Paris from around the world, and including the United States, to learn architecture and the fine arts. Went to the School of the Beaux-Arts, meaning the fine arts. Jefferson himself was not a student of the Beaux-Arts, but he was in Paris during the Beaux-Arts period, and he was very much interested in architecture. And I've talked about Maison Carrée before. It's in Nîmes, built about the time of Christ. It's a small temple, very elegant, and Jefferson was very, very much influenced by this temple. And so the architects that came to study at the Beaux-Arts, and Jefferson, a model made of this temple. He did drawings, and the model and the drawings went back to Monticello. And if you don't believe me about how much influence this little building has in this country, now I'm going to show you. There's Maison Carrée. This is the Virginia State House that Jefferson built in 1785. Here is one of the pavilions for the faculty in classrooms at the University of Virginia. You can see Monticello. It all has that same temple front, the same similar proportions. And Jefferson was an astute student of the classical vocabulary of architecture. And he probably more, if you had to say one person was responsible for all this architecture that you see that looks like this, it's Thomas Jefferson's doing. And the students that went to the Beaux-Arts and came back to this country and took that education of the classical architecture with them. Here's Maison Carrée, and what I did was I just started collecting images that buildings that looked like Jefferson would have, or they were influenced by Jefferson. And you can see here's the style portico. Here's another version of it. This one only made 4 columns, but you'll see that these columns are actually too far apart. If this were real stone, which I'm sure it's not, these columns would not, the entablature would crack. So they started taking liberty with it. This is, I think it's a Baptist church. I think it's a very handsome church, very, very prim and proper and formal, but the spacing between the columns, again, it's not the true temple front. More of these churches in Beth, I'm sorry, I deliberately didn't put the names down. I just got tired of them. There's so many. But the architects had a reasonable guide to go by. So these things aren't bad looking. Sometimes they don't get the proportions quite correct, but nevertheless, they have become the symbol for this is a church. And it's a church of reason. It's a church of rational thinking. That's the American Protestant way, I think. And there it is. And here's some more of it. And this is a variant of it. You can see there's 4 columns engaged here. And this is a Mannerist thing where you take a pediment and break it. This is a Palladian thing. Palladio was architect in the Mannerist period in Italy. And so part of that vocabulary has made it. But you could see any of these being, particularly this one being on the cover of the Hallmark Christmas card. Then I wanted to show you this one. This is a very humble church. And I know it's a church because it has a steeple in the back and it has all the elements of Maison Carrée, but the proportions are missing. And I'm not making fun at all, but I do want to say that if you don't have much money to build a church, you build a church, you still have enough money to put a porch on it, an entablature, a pediment, and some columns. So there you go. You don't need to have carved marble. You can still have a church front in the classical vocabulary. And then I want to kind of finish up with a local church in Baltimore, the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was built in 1806 to 1821 by an architect named Benjamin Latrobe. As I got further and further in this, I got more and more interested in what was going on here. And first of all, it comes from the Capitol. And that's how I got into the Dome of the Capitol, part of my investigation for the Basilica of the Assumption. And that if you read 10 articles, you Google 10 articles, 5 of them will say that Latrobe was the architect of the Capitol. Not true. Dr. William Thornton was the winner of the design competition for the US Capitol. This was his award-winning design. He received $500 and a plot of land in Washington, D.C. For his efforts. And he became the first architect of the Capitol. AOC, the AOC has been around a lot longer than a representative from New York uses those initials, but AOC has been architect of the Capitol for a couple of 100 years. Latrobe falsely was credited for designing the US Capitol. What happened, he was friends with Jefferson. Jefferson and he were in collaboration. He's a very good architect. What he did was he took over the south wing from Thornton, and he became the second architect of the Capitol. Bulfinch, parenthetically, became the third architect of the Capitol and kind of finished the whole thing to a certain point. And that's what it looked like. I think there's a very early photograph. I think this is the East before the Civil War. You can see this kind of basement level or ground level, is covered with these monumental stairs there. You can see the arches here that probably back here. Anyway, so it did go on a lot of modification, and most notably, the dome has changed quite a bit. But he was responsible for the south wing, Latrobe. And to his credit, the Bishop of Baltimore gave him the job of designing the first Catholic cathedral in the United States. And his first design was Gothic, and it was rejected, Neo-Gothic. And what happened was, it depends on which version you come up with, but Latrobe came up with another plan which was built. In version 1, the Catholic Church, which was an unwelcome religion in many of the former colonies, wanted to fit in with the popular architecture of the time, which is neoclassical. Version 2, I heard, the bishop wanted to look forward by rejecting Latrobe's original Gothic revival design and requiring Latrobe to use the forward-looking modern neoclassical design vocabulary, which is what he did. So his first inclination was to go with Gothic revival, and the bishop rejected that. Here is his first plan. It has a narthex, a nave, side aisles, transepts, and a altar and apse. There's a dome over the crossing. Here's the porch out here. There's a cruciform plan, transepts, altar, apse, and nave with the dome at the crossing, major dome. And there's a section going through the nave. Here's the porch, the narthex here. Here is a saucer dome has a skylight. I don't believe the skylight is there. And here's the main dome. And then the apse is back here with the altar. And you can see the round arches typical of neoclassical building. And here is a later drawing of it, of the hexastyle porch, the narthex nave. And what happens here, we have the transepts, and the original apse is here with the altar. And there's the main dome and the saucer dome. In that first saucer dome is the fresco of the Assumption of Mary. The main dome is the Holy Spirit. They're both quite beautiful. The altar and apse go away and are rebuilt in 1890. They expanded the back. Another saucer dome is added. And I couldn't find what the name of it is, but it looks to me as if it's the Ascension of Christ. Here's a section through the transept looking towards the entrance. That's here. And what it is the dome itself is a sphere that's drawn in the interior. So this is a three-dimensional object, and the dome wraps around it. This isn't a good drawing in that there is an outer dome that covers this oculus. It has 24 skylights on it. Here is where Latrobe, he calls the control of light into this area, he calls it lumière mystérieuse, which I'm sure he picked up from his travels in France, seeing the dome of the Pantheon. Now, where did he get this idea from? Well, if you do a cross section through the Pantheon in Rome, which was built 113 to 125 AD, it too is formed around a sphere. It has an open oculus, and that's how that dome ended up being. And these are the two saucer domes, 1 and 2, Mary and Christ. And then here is the Holy Spirit in the oculus with the lumière mystérieuse, nave, altar, apse. And I'll just go through this really quickly. It has all the elements of classical architecture. And that'll take us to next week, which is the return to true Christian architecture, the Gothic. So
during 18th century England, a backlash movement began that wanted to return to the true Christian architecture as part of the coming Romantic period of art. Gothic architecture becomes popular as we will see this style was applied to government and secular buildings both, as well as churches.